I'm just standing in front of Oakland Institute, an independent policy think tank who have done a lot of research on policy and advocacy around the world on land issues. They have done a recent report on Sri Lanka. We're going to explore into what they have done so far and what kind of the working methodologies they have used. So I'm going to go in and interview Dr. Anuradha Mittal, an executive director of Oakland Institute. Coming to Oakland Institute, an independent policy think tank, we have the executive director of Oakland Institute, Anuradha Mittal. Anuradha, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So there's, we want to talk about a report that you authored recently, but before going into, I would like to know a bit more about the Oakland Institute and your work. I mean, far away from the shades of New York and all the advocacy, here in this nice part of Oakland. So what is it all about? What is the Institute's work so far?
Well, the Oakland Institute is an independent policy think tank. We were formed in 2004. This was the time of the second term of election for President Bush. And we came into being with the realization that United States, the world needs a progressive think tank, not a liberal think tank, but a progressive think tank. Our goal is to do research analysis on issues that we believe are very pertinent to our lives, social, economic, environmental issues. We work on issues that are of relevance to foreign policy of the United States, to domestic issues within the country, as well as international issues, because we believe there's a link between the local and the global. We have worked on issues that could be generally classified as international development issues as they relate to food, agriculture, human rights, land issues. And that work has taken us around the world. We don't have a regional focus, we have issue focus, whereas an independent think tank, we can provide information and research and reports and tools which can be really tools that can be used by the communities that are being impacted. So whether these are smallholder farmers in some country in Africa, or whether it is indigenous groups in Ethiopia, or whether it is communities in Papua New Guinea who are losing the traditional rights to land.
Yeah, I can see that you've done a lot of work in Africa, especially in Kenya and certain countries, then Pacific, South America, and so on. Before we go into that areas, just to have a quick, you are situated in a place where redwood and land grabs are quite common in a way. So what kind of efforts you have taken here, like, you know, because it's where you are.
Exactly. Well, I mean, just to say, we decided and chose to be in Oakland, unlike you know, outside the Beltway, Washington, D.C., New York, for a reason. Oakland is one of the most diverse cities in the United States, most diversely integrated. It is also the birthplace of Black Panther movement. It has been the birthplace and a vibrant place when the Occupy movement was happening, or around Black Lives Matter. So the history of Oakland is very important, and therefore I named the Oakland Institute. And it's interesting you say that we are sitting in a place where land grabs have happened. In fact, when we work in places like Ethiopia, when we see the rights of the ethnic minorities or the indigenous being violated, their resources taken away, it reminds me of places like United States or Canada or Australia, where the rights of the indigenous were violated, they were annihilated, they were destroyed, their livelihoods, their lives ended, to find those lands taken over. And that actually supports and inspires our work to stop that mayhem from happening around the world. At the same time, in the United States, we are going through another form of land grabs. We just last year, actually, we put out a report called Down on the Farm, which shows that over the next 20 years, 400 million acres of land will change hands in the United States. Nearly half of the country's farmland will change hand. And instead of land passing from family farmers to the next generation or somebody else who wants to farm the land, these are private equity funds. These are pension funds who are moving in to take over agricultural lands so they can speculate on it, they can grow as they want, to export to faraway places with no concern
work in Africa, do you want to mention certain areas that you're active currently? Because I've seen you worked in many countries.
Well, in case of Ethiopia, I mean, as a think tank, we have put out country reports which provide an academic analysis of if you're going to lease your natural resources such as land and water, and these are not like 5-year lease, 10-year lease, we're talking about 99-year lease. What are the implications in terms of job creation, food security, infrastructure development? So we have done country reports from Tanzania, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Zambia. I'm forgetting some countries now. But we've also, gotten very involved in specific land cases. For instance, in the case of Ethiopia, where the government has decided to bring development by leasing over 7 million hectares of land. People need to remember this is not unused land. This is land that has been used by the pastoralist and agro-pastoralist. What is happening to them when they're being displaced? What consultations taking place? What is happening with free, prior, informed consent? What is happening to media? What is happening to civil society? Is there any recourse when people are forcibly displaced? That is just one country. We're very active in Tanzania, where we are looking at, again in the name of development, when the foreign investors are coming in, what has happened to the local communities, how they've been displaced, what has been the resettlement process, what kind of economic benefits are coming to the communities as well as to the national economies.
I mean, in the same note, PNG is another classic example, because the logging is continuous for over, I would say, 3-4 decades now, isn't it? So the question I want to ask you is how effective your policy advocacy is, because almost all of the cases you're dealing with governments or multinational corporations, and being a think tank, putting the information out, and how much of an impact that you have created in terms of awareness, in terms of advocacy, and so on?
You know, that's a really good question, because, you know, if you're a service provider, and I can say every night because of our work, 100 people go to bed after having a meal. It's easier, but as a policy think tank, when you're putting out information, when you're pushing for policy changes, it is harder to determine your success.
It's harder to quantify. Exactly.
But having said that, and I don't mean to be boastful, you know, when I think of specific cases, for example, we exposed the largest land deal in Tanzania, which involved a US-based investor who was going to take over 800,000 acres of land, saying nobody lived on that land. And our work exposed that this land deal would displace over 170,000 people who were smallholder farmers. Our expose got people in Tanzania mobilized, and students in Iowa and civil society in Iowa mobilized, and that land deal was cancelled. Similarly, we exposed the largest land deal in South Sudan, which involved a US former ambassador for refugee affairs who managed to get 1 million hectares of land for $25,000. And once the news got out what had happened, people in South Sudan mobilized and had the land deal cancelled. Because of our work, the Tanzanian government declared that they would not do any more large-scale land leases. No land lease would be above 5,000 hectares. Still problematic for us, but they did that. In case of Papua New Guinea, the government announced the cancellation of all the illegal land deals, which were made for supposedly agricultural development, but they were really schemes for logging. The government has yet to take action after saying they'll cancel those deals. In case of Ethiopia, our continuous exposés have led to United States, which is one of the largest supporters of Ethiopia, to put language in appropriations bill, both in 2014 and in 2015, that our development monies cannot be used for programs which are forcibly displacing people from Gambela and Lower Omo, 2 areas that we have focused on.
So your work revolves around land mainly, because livelihoods are dependent on land. So your recent report or recent research work based on Sri Lankan land grab, and we have seen 2 reports out on that, and it's a report after you have personally been there with a team and actually done the research and so on. So first of all, what made you to actually go into Sri Lanka, and what made you to actually choose, because it's far away, and then especially at this time? Let's go one by one. So what made you to go in there?
Well, you know, since 2007, 2008, a lot of our focus has been on land rights. We have looked at land issues in faraway places like Papua New Guinea, many African countries in Latin America. The reason we were interested to look at Sri Lanka was, on one hand, you had reports from, say, Forbes magazine, which talk about since the end of the war in 2009, it's a great place for investment, there's peace, security. Having worked in other places such as, Sierra Leone or South Sudan, which have gone through conflict, it seemed like good to compare and see how things are so different within 6 years. You have Lonely Planet, which is talking about Sri Lanka as a destination for all tourists. And at the same time, there were some media reports around land issues and land seizures, which were linked to the civil war. So the reason for us was to go and to look and understand as an independent policy think tank. We wanted to do research for ourselves. As you mentioned, I was there myself with the research team. We spent time on the ground for a variety of reasons, which had to do with the logistics and the timing. Our fieldwork was conducted in December 2014. Political tensions were very high just before the elections. You required, clearance from Ministry of Defense to go into the northern province. It was a trip that was done and could not cover the entire eastern province or the entire northern province, but we were able to visit key places to see for ourselves what the reality is.
So that report itself have brought out a lot of issues. You have mentioned about land grabs, not just land grabs from the government side of things, also multinational corporations trying to invest and so on. I could see there is kind of an emphasis put on the East more, because you have actually visited many focus groups in the East, but also you have visited North. Have you seen any kind of difference between the East and the North in terms of the land grab?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting when you look at East and North. In case of the Eastern Province, it feels the mission has been accomplished. Land grabs in Sri Lanka are very different from other research that we have done. It is, when I think of Papua New Guinea, when I think of some of the African countries, it has been foreign investors. In case of Sri Lanka, it is the Sri Lankan army. It is some of the domestic investors. Looking for opportunities to set up hotels, and of course ties with political ties with all kind of very prominent people, for instance the Rajapaksa family. You have land grabs that go back 25 years ago during the height of the civil war. So it was definitely a very complex story, and in case of Eastern Province, though it looks like things are normal, but as I said, mission has been accomplished. The demographics of the Eastern Province have changed. The Tamil are no longer the majority. Other than Vavuniya, most of the places, Tamils are no longer the majority. The settlement that has gone on for years, for decades, where people from the south and the Sinhalese and the army and the soldiers that have been moved into that province, who have taken over the farms, who have taken over lands and homes of people, the victory monuments that you see, it feels like the fate has been sealed. In case of North, you realize that the war is barely over. I mean, in Jaffna, for instance, when you move away from the main street, you go into the side streets, you see those bullet pockmarked homes. The infrastructure is missing. Yes, Sri Lanka has revived since the end of the war. The South now even has democracy and a new government. But in case of North and East, the war has not been over. It continues, it rages.
But the Sri Lankan government has rejected your report, and they have actually cited that there are progress in terms of resettlement, and also they have said that the new government has taken steps. Have you followed through with the new government's approach, and what do you have to say to the rejection of the report?
Well, it is disappointing, though not surprising, that the Sri Lankan government has rejected our report. It's very rare to find a thief to say, I am a thief. So it is very disappointing.
I mean, especially in the context of the regime change.
Definitely. I mean, for us, the intent of the report was not to be critical of the new government. As an independent think tank, we have come and brought forward evidence that is there. Now let's look at the response of the new government. High Commissioner of Canada says, what are they talking about? There are no internally displaced people. Now, in the light of the evidence that we bring, the testimonies, the photographs, you can either be an ostrich with your head stuck in sand, or you can deal with this crisis as a democratic country with a new government. Let's deal with the problem we have. We have another High Commissioner says that there are no war widows. 90,000 women are estimated to be war widows in the east and north, with 50,000 of them being in the eastern province. How do you deny the existence of people? Is it like the denial of 140,000 people who are missing? I mean, this is not a denying game. And then the response of the government has been that our research team was not even present in Sri Lanka. I mean, it should be fairly easy to look at the visa department. A business visa was issued by the Washington Embassy. The Ministry of Defense provided the clearance. These are not forged documents. It's pretty simple and pretty savvy. So in terms of response, for a government which is saying that they're moving ahead with reconciliation and justice, it is not about their word against our word. It is about their word against their own actions. Who has been appointed as the Chief of Staff of the Army, the highest post? A general who has been allegedly committed war crimes, even according to groups such as Human Rights Watch. This government, which talks about reconciliation, still celebrates, victory parades, whereas even an opportunity for families and communities to remember the missing ones was banned this May. So if you have real intent for reconciliation, your actions speak for you. So this is not about if our findings are correct or not. I think we have to look at the words of the government and their own deeds.
I think one of the part, especially the second report, when I was reading through, there was this little story you mentioned about an internment camp, which is still there for 25 years or more. If I'm right, it's neither one camp. So you also mentioned about a story about a little boy who was following through, because it touched my heart as well when I was reading. So these are kind of evidence that people are still living. So can you describe a little bit about their pledge, because they were not made homeless or landless recently. They were there for a long time. So what was the feeling like that from them, like as an external person, an independent person going in? How did you felt when I went into that camp, especially the internment camp?
Well, I have to say I was not prepared for what I would see and how I would feel. I was just emotionally and mentally not prepared. So as you said, walking into this camp, which was built over 25 years ago, when in the name of high security zone, their lands, their homes were taken over by the Sri Lankan army, and then taken over for good because their farms are being exploited for the soldiers who are growing produce on those farms, and they bring it to the local market and sell it below the cost of production. Or the lands where 7-star resorts such as Hotel Thalsevana has been put up by the Sri Lankan army. I could have gone to the website or called the Ministry of Defense and made a booking and stayed in that hotel where the Chief Minister of Northern Province cannot go. To see these people living in these camps 25 years later, those camps were built 25 years ago. They are in very bad condition. A lot of the rains had come heavily the day before. A lot of the homes, actually I should say huts or shacks, had been destroyed and had come down under the rain. Overcrowded homes because families have grown in size with no infrastructure. They're taking in those families who were left without a home. To see their kitchens, I don't know if you could call it a kitchen, to see this little hole where they would gather wood so they could burn it to cook a meal, to have no access to water, to see homes with no electricity where young girls, elderly people, children have to go to some 8 toilets meant for over 250 people in the night with no electricity. To see this young boy who was following me around, as you said in the report, because these are unsafe places. His elder brother had been bitten by a snake, so this mother, whose husband was white-wanned and is missing, was in the hospital. I had to step back and ask, can you imagine raising your child in this place? According to the Sri Lankan government, no more internally displaced people remain in the country. So there is no program, there is no food aid, there is no job, no NGOs, no international NGOs. Nobody is there. And as one person said, this is the height of despair. As one person said, even if President Obama came here and tried to do something, he could not get us back to our homes. They left homes which were fertile, they were close to the oceans, they fished, they had a good life with dignity. Today, they live with despair, they live with darkness, where young women have no options. Nobody would marry them. There are no school for children. This is
another point that I want to go into about the combatants, rehabilitated combatants in the government's view, because you said there's no jobs and so on. Because how the rehabilitation has gone through? Have you actually seen any? Have you actually met any of the rehabilitated combatants, former combatants?
Well, during the course of my field work, both in Eastern Province as well as in the Northern Province, I did meet a lot of ex-combatants who were formerly, with LTDE, people who have then surrendered, who underwent, almost all of them undergone rehabilitation, spent many years in the jails, released. A lot of the women combatants didn't have to go to prison, but they were offered rehabilitation opportunities. But what is striking is that despite that rehabilitation, it is almost impossible for them to find jobs. The discrimination, the stigma, everyone knows who are the Vani warriors or the Vani returnees. If you're one of them, it's a stigma. You can't find a job. You can't start your life again. You're discriminated against when it comes to finding a housing, the different schemes that are there for people whose homes were destroyed during the war.
It's a pretty desperate situation for them because it's not only the opportunities but also from the society as well. I mean, we can go on talk about that issue, but we would like to move on. I mean, I'm not intentionally moving on, sure. But you mentioned about the international intervention or kind of Obama visiting as a kind of a connotation that people said, because that's where I want to go now. Because even the international in kind of governments or international institutions like UN, they have actually put up Sri Lanka on their agenda for some times now, from soon after the war ended. So what kind of impact that has created is there are quite a lot of focus on war crimes, or at least about the regime itself. But what would you say, in your opinion, the geopolitical interest? Because it seems that the US and the rest of the international community is not very much interested in the issue after the regime change. So have you actually found anything, or what is your take on that?
Yeah, it is really unfortunate that with the regime change from Rajapaksa's government to President Sirisena's government, the international community seems to have taken a step back, which belies what is really happening in the country. I think for the international community to fail to understand the historical context behind the civil war and the ongoing discrimination, the idea of building a Sinhalese state and nationalism built around your Sinhalese identity and land and religion, to expect that any kind of domestic mechanism will ensure justice for minorities in the countries, the Tamils, the Christians, the Muslims, is basically, fooling ourselves. I know the regime change does offer an opportunity, say, to the United States, that instead of focusing on human rights or internally displaced people, they can focus on the geostrategic interest. They can try to get closer to Sri Lanka because of the interest over maritime routes and maritime waters. India suddenly sees an opportunity to get closer to Sri Lanka and try to get China out of the domestic picture. But this geostrategic, short-sighted interest get in the way of ensuring true peace and security, not just within Sri Lanka, but in the region. So that's why I think these are short-sighted mistakes that I hope the international community will not make. Secondly, we have international laws. We are an international community. Given the ravages of the war, and given the way the war ended, and given the continued ravages of the war even today, it is the duty and the responsibility of the international community to step in and ensure justice. It can't be a political choice. It cannot be a political dilemma. It is the responsibility.
Because that brings to a question where the previous actions of the international community during the war or after the war, because the intentions are questionable now, isn't it? Because if they have actually lacked interest after a regime change, because that actually brings into another question, because where Tamil advocacy is concerned, they see that it is a genocide, ongoing structural genocide in the island. But whereas international community would like to, or they are trying to confine all investigation within the war crimes paradigm. So as an external person looking at this, I'm just coming on the land issue only. I'm not asking a general political sense, because land is everything. It's livelihood. Because when the land is taken away from somebody, and they're no one, and in terms of their identity, in terms of their livelihood, economy, and so on. So in that angle, how you look at this struggle? I mean, because I know it's a difficult question for you, but in that angle, how are you looking at? Because the international law says that crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, war crimes, all comes of international law, right? So there is a kind of a mismatch between the Tamil advocacy, the Tamil people's advocacy towards justice, and whereas the international community, how it looks at it.
Well, you know, we have the privilege of not being a politician. So as an independent think tank, you know, we have to look at the struggles that have happened in the past. You know, there's a thing called convenient, and then there's a thing called conviction. The international community can choose the convenient path. I mean, we cannot ignore the fact that the international community failed the Tamil population during the Civil War and towards the end of the Civil War. Not just the international community, but the United Nations failed when on its watch. No-fly zones were bombed. Innocent civilians were killed.
Because they have a good excuse then, like it's fighting against the LTTE, because they classed LTTE as a terrorist in their mind. So it was kind of a justification given by the government, and it was
international law. It is still a violation. There were two sides at war. Like Sri Lanka cannot be called a terrorist state, LTTE cannot be called a terrorist organization. Again, I am just expressing my opinion as an independent think tank. Let's not forget Nelson Mandela was once called a terrorist. ANC was once a terrorist. International community needs to follow the conviction of international human rights to investigate and put forward the truth, so reconciliation can happen. In the absence of the truth, there can be no reconciliation. Convenience does not always remain convenient. It becomes inconvenient. And that is the inconvenient truth of the civil war in Sri Lanka. You have to understand what caused the rebel separatist movement. That is rooted in the history of pogroms, killings, discrimination, Sinhala-only law. That discrimination and killings and burning of homes gave birth to a separatist movement. And if we choose to ignore it, I think we're making a mistake.
So coming back to the current situation, you had a chance to meet the Chief Minister, Honorable Vigneswaran, and also you have seen how the Northern Provincial Council operates in terms of their work. Now, it seems that they're not actually going much progress in terms of moving forward. How do you look at this? Because the situation is quite bad. Because what happens in these kind of situations is that when you have an opportunity, if you don't seize it, it gets worse. How the United Nations have handled this crisis, like in your opinion, and what do you think need to be done?
Well, first of all, I would say human rights are never won without a fight. You know, you look at the civil rights movement, women's right to vote, you look at struggles of South Africa, they were not won overnight. And that's what I would say in terms of the TNA and the Northern Provincial Council. I
mean, one of the reasons why I brought Northern Provincial Council is that UN Human Rights Council, for up to some extent, pats on his back saying their resolutions brought about the elections and setting up the Northern Provincial Council. Yet there is no progress. So that's one of the reasons why I brought that into the mix of the question.
And but what I did witness was people are not giving up. They continue to organize, they continue to demand, they continue to mobilize. And I think that's important to keep saying that. In terms of what needs to happen, I think we do know the previous government had not allowed the UN inquiry and its administrators and investigators to go into the country.
I think still they don't have access inside.
And they still don't have. So I hope, despite all the work that has been done, for instance, our report, we have said we are making all of those testimonies we gathered available to you, that it will be an honest report. More important, it's not the release of the report, is what comes next. We know what international law would say, that an international mechanism for judicial process should be set up. Given the context of Sri Lanka, where regime change has changed the government, but policies haven't changed. The Sinhala only state, its identity rooted in Sinhala, which is based on discriminating and marginalizing the minorities further, nothing has changed. So domestic mechanism is impossible. Any politician with the best intent, best hopes, best dedication to justice cannot do it within the Sri Lankan context. And that's why we have seen international, hybrid, other processes happen. Let's learn from places such as Yugoslavia. Let's learn from other places such as Rwanda, or look at places such as Cambodia. So if we want to pursue truth and reconciliation, our hope is that the United Nations would follow its mandate instead of play games of politicians.
So the situation is quite dire, and especially there is no hope in a way, the international sense. What will be next in terms of your work? Because you have started a report, so what kind of follow-up are you going to do, and have you followed up with the Sri Lankan government? Obviously they have rejected the report, but obviously in terms of following up, so what kind of initiatives have you taken so far from the release of the report?
Well, one of the big goals of putting out this report, and when we did, was to reignite the debate, excuse my language, but to get the debate going again, that regime change doesn't mean that things are all fine and dandy. We wanted to bring forward evidence that has not been brought forward, to inform and educate the media, to inform the policymakers. We have seen millions of media impressions around the world. We have seen mainstream media pick up the story and report on what's happening within the country, which has put pressure on the Sri Lankan government, causing it to reject the report, take some baby steps in terms of releasing some of the lands. For instance, we talked about Sampur, we talked about, in the northern province, Palali. I call them baby steps because they're very immature steps. People are being sent back to places where there's no infrastructure that can be called a home. They do not have their farms to farm. There's no infrastructure to help people resettle. But we believe that is a response to the kind of evidence that we brought forward. For us now, we see as continuing to educate the international community and putting pressure in all ways that we can, that knowing what has actually happened, that an international judicial process takes place after the report is released. In terms of interaction with the Sri Lankan government, as I said, we hope that they'll learn from the report. Hopefully they can take some big steps, but hopefully they can also ask for international help, because we acknowledge the fact it will be very hard for any party, any politician within Sri Lanka to ensure justice for the minorities. We understand they're in a very difficult situation, and they should ask for international help.
So if they invite you back in the country, will you be happy to visit again?
I fell in love with Sri Lanka. I would love to go back to Jaffna. I would love to go back to Vavani. I would love to go back to Kilinochchi, Patikalawa, Trincomalee, and I would love to go back and visit the communities. It would be even more beautiful of a trip if I could go back and meet the women, the mothers, the sisters, wives who are waiting for their missing husbands, brothers, and sons to return.
So thank you very much for sharing your experience in Sri Lanka and about your report. I'm privileged to be here and hosted by your organization, so thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.